They had no flag, no anthem, not even a name they claimed as their own. And yet, across Persia and the Levant, kings tightened their guard at night. Viziers whispered their prayers twice, because when the wind shifted just right, you could almost hear it. A name not spoken aloud, but carried like a curse in the back of the throat. Assassins. For more than a century, they moved like mist, unseen, untraceable, unforgettable. They left behind no manifestos, no monuments, only silence and bodies. And even now, with the fortress of Alamet long turned to dust, the history still cannot fully explain how they existed, or why they vanished, or if they ever truly did. Tonight, we journey into that silence, not to glorify violence, but to understand why their name still stirs something in us. An unease, a chill, a fascination we cannot quite name. So if you enjoy drifting into these quieter corners of forgotten history, take a moment to subscribe or leave a like. It helps keep these stories breathing, slowly, softly, like this one. Now, relax. Let the weight of the day slide off your shoulders. Close your eyes, and let history whisper to you. While empires clashed over banners and gods, while cities rose and burned for reasons no one remembered, in a remote, wind-bitten corner of the Alborz Mountains, a different kind of power began to take root. No armies, no borders, just an idea, one so dangerous. It didn't need to shout. It only needed to be believed. At the heart of it was a man named Hashashin, not a warlord, not a prophet, but something far more patient. A thinker, a strategist, a man who knew that fear, placed carefully, could do what no sword ever could. He didn't seize Alamet with force. He outthought it. He planted doubt, then belief, and when he walked through its gates in 1090, the fortress didn't fall. It accepted him. From within those walls, he began to train not killers, but believers. The ones history would come to call Fadasped, the sacrificed. They weren't taught to hate. They were taught to understand. Philosophy, theology, disciplines so deep it rewrote instinct. And at the core of it, a question, what would you die for? The answers weren't shouted. They were whispered in candlelit corridors, etched into ritual, sealed into silence. They didn't fight a nation. They fought an idea that only the powerful had the right to decide who lived and who didn't. They didn't raise armies. They raised one soul at a time, each willing to vanish, each willing to kill, each willing to die. And the world had no defense for that. They struck quietly, in the middle of a market, on the steps of a mosque, inside the home of a prince, surrounded by guards. There was no grand announcement, only a single precise motion, and then silence. But what truly terrified their enemies was not the dagger. It was the calm, the way these men moved without panic, without fear, without hesitation. They did not flee. They did not speak. They did not beg for their lives, because in truth, they had already given them away. The Fidasbe didn't wear symbols. They carried no coins, no scrolls, no letters, just a blade, and a mind disciplined like stone worn by centuries of water. They had been chosen, not because they were strong, but because they believed. Inside Alamet, belief was sharpened. Belief became vision, and vision became action. Young initiates arrived as boys, often no older than 15. They did not come to learn how to kill. They came to learn why they must sometimes die. Their education began not in training yards, but in libraries. Ancient books lined the walls. Mathematics, astronomy, language, scripture, and philosophy. They were taught to ask questions, to argue, to think, because only a man who understands life has the right to take it. There are whispers, still debated, of a garden hidden deep inside the fortress, a place where new initiates were shown a paradise, lush, blooming, fragrant with wine and music, where every pleasure was offered freely. And then they were taken away, told it was only a glimpse, a shadow of what awaited those who gave themselves completely to the cause. Truth, myth, maybe both, but in the order. Belief and imagination walked hand in hand, and when belief becomes stronger than fear, a man can become unstoppable. They didn't strike constantly. They didn't need to. Sometimes a single death, delivered in the right city, at the right time, to the right man, could shake an empire to its knees, and then they would vanish. Not into wilderness, but into crowds, disguised as pilgrims, as students, as scribes. It wasn't stat about the blade. It was about placement, timing, conviction. They didn't kill to create chaos. They killed to remove it. To them, violence was not savagery. It was a correction. In the great courts of power, where rulers feasted and feared no one, the fear of the assassin grew, because they didn't know what they were fighting. A nation? A sect? A cult? No borders. No flags. No army to march against. Just the knowledge that someone was always watching. Someone who could wait 10 years for the right moment. Someone who could live beside you, serve you, pray with you, and when the time was right, end your life with a single motion. That uncertainty was more terrifying than death itself. Even the most powerful began to falter. Grand viziers tripled their guards. Sultans refused to eat food, not prepared by blood relatives. Some sent gifts to Alamut, not out of friendship, but fear, because sometimes, when destruction cannot be stopped, it is better to buy its silence. No one knows how Hassan I Saba felt about these gestures. He accepted some, ignored others, but never answered directly. He ruled Alamut like a ghost, rarely seen, never careless, and always listening. His command was quiet, not barked through courtyards, but passed from eye to eye, gesture to gesture. No couriers, no messengers, and yet, the right blade always reached the right neck, at the right time. Some say it was sorcery, others say it was math. But what we know is this: every action was deliberate, measured. A man might wait a decade to be placed at a gate, in a court, at a tea ceremony, for one moment. And when it came, he did not flinch. He acted and smiled, because to him, death was not failure. It was fulfillment. Not all who died by their hand were kings. Some were scholars. Some were judges. Some were simply voices too loud, too dangerous, too cruel. The Fidas Bey did not kill to gain. They killed to remove. Their targets were chosen with precision, not for wealth or revenge, but for balance. And this was the part no army could understand, because armies obeyed. They followed orders. They raised flags. They marched for causes written by others. But the assassins, they believed, not in a ruler, not in a reward, but in a vision, a belief that the world was broken and that it could be corrected, one quiet act at a time. There was no recruiting, no pamphlets, no coin offered for service. Those who entered Alamut came because they already felt it, the imbalance, the sickness of the world, and they wanted to heal it. The training was long, harsh, not in cruelty, but in depth. They memorized verses. They debated ethics. They fasted. They remained silent for days. They watched each other in stillness. And only when a soul could endure silence, without losing itself, was it ready to live unseen, ready to die unheard. Some left before they ever began. Some broke. Some faded. But those who remained forever. There are stories, half true, half legend, of men who waited years inside enemy palaces, who married, had children, built entire second lives, and when the time came, they struck, not with anger, but with clarity. One such man, his name lost to time, served a powerful vizier as an advisor. 13 years he waited. He earned his trust, was granted land, even a position of command. And then, on a night with no moon, he sat across from the vizier, shared a drink, spoke softly of the stars, and reached into his robe. The blade was already drawn, the motion effortless. When guards burst into the room, he was still seated, still calm, still breathing slowly. He did not resist. He did not run. He welcomed death like an old companion, because for him, the mission had already ended. It sits easy to call that madness, but madness rages. Madness flails. This was not madness. This was devotion. There are whispers, too, of those who failed, who were caught, interrogated, but not one, not a single one, ever spoke of the order. Not a name, not a place, not a method, because the method wasn't it held in words. It was etched into breath, into muscle, into silence. Even if they wanted to tell you, they couldn't set, because they only ever knew their piece, their moment, their part in a story, too large to see in full. And that made them invincible, not in strength, not in number, but in mystery. No army could kill what it couldn't spy. No spies could infiltrate what had no clear structure. No bribe could twist a mind that had already made peace with death. And so, for decades, the shadow remained, unbroken, unanswerable. Even the Crusaders spoke of them. In their journals, their letters, their trembling prayers in foreign tongues, they wrote not of armies, but of two men who approached a king in daylight and killed him with no warning. They didn't instead flee. They didn't deny. They simply waited, quiet, while the guards cut them down. And still, no one knew why. The king had been an ally, a Christian. Why would a Muslim sect murder a man on their side? That was the question that echoed through stone halls and cold chambers, because the assassins didn't spite sides. They fought threats to their belief, to their order, to balance. They didn't see banners, they saw causes, and that made them terrifying to all sides. Some Crusader lords, afraid, sent gifts to Alamet, letters, bribes, even treaties. Some tried to use the assassins as pawns, as blades for hire. But the assassins could not be bought. They moved on their own rhythm, guided by something older and deeper than coin. One story tells of Richard the Lionheart, a king known for his sword, his pride, his crusade. It is said he once sent a message to Alamet, asking that his men be spared. The answer never came in writing, but one morning, his envoy woke to find a dagger placed beside his bed. No sound, no intrusion, just a message. If we wanted to reach you, we already have. That dagger said everything. From that day forward, even kings watch the shadows more closely, because death, when it comes without warning, turns every corner into a question. And once a man begins to question the loyalty of those around him, he weakens, he hesitates, and the order never needed to strike again. Sometimes fear was enough. Back in the mountains, Alamet stood quiet, stone against snow. Its walls never roared, its banners never flapped, but inside, 1,000 thoughts were in motion, codes being memorized, maps drawn from memory, texts translated in candlelight, because this was not just a fortress, it was a sanctuary for knowledge. The library of Alamet, they say, held scriptures from all faiths, philosophy from Greeks and Persians, poetry, mathematics, even forbidden works. Knowledge was not feared here. It was sharpened, like the mind that would one day wield a blade, because the assassins understood the sharpest weapon is not steel. It is an idea perfectly placed in a mind ready to act. And yet, for all their precision, for all their control, the assassins were still human. They wept. They doubted. They prayed alone at night, to a silence even Alamet could not answer. Because belief is not a shield, it is a weight, and those who carried it with solemnity, not pride. Some broke under it, quietly, without drama. Just a slow retreat into the background, never to be summoned again. Others stood straighter the longer they bore it, like trees in wind. One account, passed through centuries of whisper, speaks of a young recruit tasked with delivering a message hidden in the folds of a cloth. He traveled across deserts, through checkpoints. He slept in the dirt, ate with beggars, and kept the cloth pressed to his chest, like a second heart. The message was never read, but when he arrived, the man waiting simply looked at him and nodded once. That was enough, because in the order, meaning did not live in words. It lived in action, and every action, no matter how small, was part of something vast. Even now, centuries later, we don't yet know all their names. We don't yet know all their targets. We don't yet know how many succeeded, or how many died unknown, but we feel their shape in the folds of history, in revolutions that started without warning, in the fall of tyrants whose death had no trail, in the rumors passed down in dusty scrolls, in fading murals, in faintly carved symbols on walls no one visits anymore. Their story is not one of blood. It is one of silence. They did not destroy for the sake of destruction. They pruned. They adjusted, like a gardener with a single shears, cutting not to kill, but to preserve what still had the chance to bloom. And when Alamet finally fell, it didn't yet scream. It didn't yet burn with vengeance. Its halls were emptied, its books hidden or destroyed, its memory scattered like seeds. But some say a few survived, not as warriors, but as whispers. A man here, a woman there, carrying not the dagger, but the idea, living quietly, listening always, and waiting, just in case the world ever needed balance again. They never celebrated. There were no chants, no toasts raised to victory, no songs sung in the aftermath of a mission, because in the eyes of the order, a successful kill was not a triumph. It was a necessity, one less tyrant, one less voice poisoning the minds of the people, one adjustment in the delicate balance between chaos and silence. The outside world called them fanatics, extremists, creatures of myth and shadow. They were blamed for every mysterious death, feared in every court, accused in every whispered conspiracy. But the truth was more elusive. The assassins didn't seek power. They never sat on thrones, never built empires. They knew all those things crumbled eventually. Instead, they worked in the cracks, in the quiet moments between history sips pages, and there, they wrote their truth, not in ink, but in actions. Inside Alamet, not all who served were killers. There were scribes, teachers, mothers, women who preserved texts, taught medicine, kept the order septs, rituals alive, through memory and symbol. Some even trained initiates, disguised as caretakers, as cooks, as midwives. And perhaps, in rare and unrecorded moments, they too walked the path of the blade. But their stories, like so much of the order, were never written down, because true service wasn't about being remembered. It was about knowing the fire stayed lit, even when no one saw who fed the flame. The world outside changed. New kings rose, old empires fractured, languages shifted, maps were redrawn, But within the mountain wind, Alamet remained, a single point of stillness in a world always chasing motion. And then, inevitably, the silence was broken. The Mongols came, not with bribes, not with fear, but with fire. They didn't negotiate. They didn't hesitate. They marched with a different kind of certainty, the certainty of annihilation. They crushed cities like sand under stone, burned libraries, erased names, and when they turned their gaze to Alamet, the world held its breath. The fortress had withstood so much: spies, sieges, assassinations, whispers. But the Mongols weren't afraid, and when they arrived, the mountain trembled. There are many accounts of what happened. Some say the assassins resisted. Others say they vanished before the gates were breached. Some say the last of them set fire to their own libraries, burned every document, destroyed every trace, because if they could not survive, then their silence must. When the Mongols entered the fortress, they found no treasure, no leaders, no answers, just echoes. And the echo of an idea is the hardest thing to kill. Some say the order ended there. Others believe it did not end, only scattered, that its members faded into other lands, other names, other robes, that they no longer carried daggers, but ideas, that they watched and waited for a world, once again, out of balance. You can kill a thought. You can destroy buildings. You can burn scrolls. You can slaughter every name you know. But when an idea is planted deep enough, it outlives memory. It survives by changing form. And so, the assassins disappeared from the eyes of history, from the records of kings, from the edges of war maps. But the fear remained, because the true victory of the order was not the lives they took. It was the doubt they left behind. Rulers questioned their guards. Priests mistrusted their scribes. Generals looked twice at their own sons. Because once the idea is planted, that anyone could be one of them, no one sleeps well again. There are tales, scattered and strange, of men who lived long after Alamet fell. Men who appeared in distant lands with quiet knowledge, strange rituals, and no known past. One was a teacher in a village, whose students vanished into foreign courts and never returned. Another was a woman healer, who spoke 5 languages and refused every offer of silver. None ever claimed the name, but those who met them felt something familiar, a discipline that ran deeper than silence. Some scholars believe the remnants of the order survived in fragments, that they reshaped themselves, that they found ways to endure without being seen, in remote mountain communities, in the margins of spiritual sects, even in the founding stones of newer philosophies. Not killing, not striking, just preserving something the world wasn't set ready to lose. And maybe that was the point all along. The assassins didn't want power. They wanted continuity. Not rule, but memory. A memory of what it meant to live for something greater than yourself, to act with precision, to resist tyranny quietly, to choose clarity over noise, discipline over desire, purpose over survival. Some argue it was just myth, a medieval ghost story, exaggerated by frightened kings and traveling poets. But if it was only myth, why did armies change their tactics? Why did empires shift their alliances? Why did history itself bend around their shadow? Because even if a ghost isn't set real, if it changes the course of a king's hand, it might as well be. The truth is not always found in fact. Sometimes it's spent in what people fear the most. There are records, faded with time, of entire cities pausing when word spread that an assassin might be near. Markets closed, weddings delayed, rulers refused to leave their chambers, because when a blade can reach anyone, everyone becomes a target. It was never about how many they killed, It was about how many looked over their shoulder. And that is a kind of power no empire can match. Because no army can stand if its general fears his own servants. One chronicle tells of a judge, known for cruelty, for handing down sentences meant to break, not reform. He stood in a pulpit, preaching fire and control. And then one day, he didn't show up. His guards found him in his chamber, unmarked, but lifeless. No sign of entry, no cause of death, just a small token left on his desk, a feather, meaningless to some, to others, a signature. The work of the Fadasti was not always a blade. Sometimes it was a message, a silent correction, a removal. The idea that even the most powerful could be unmade, without violence, if the message was understood. This kind of precision requires more than strength. It requires a mind trained not to react, but to calculate. Inside Alamut, that was the true training. They learned when not to act, when to listen, how to wait. Some waited for years. There is a story, rarely spoken, of a man who served in the kitchen of a palace. He was invisible, kind, silent. He poured wine, washed floors, spoke little. One day, when the vizier sat for his meal, he took the first sip and died moments later. The man did not flee. He folded his hands, he closed his eyes, and he whispered something no one could understand. He had been in the palace for 5 years, and in that time, not a single soul suspected him. That was the art. Infiltration, not by disguise, but by becoming. By erasing oneself so thoroughly, you are no longer seen. And when that moment came, not out of hate, but of purpose, the act would feel inevitable. Like gravity, like time. That's what made them so feared. Not rage, not strength, but calm. Because when a man acts without fear, without the need for escape, he becomes something else. He becomes fate. Many believed the assassins worshipped death, but that was never true. They worshipped alignment. They studied the world as a body out of rhythm, and believed that, with one careful incision, it could be set right again. They did not relish killing. They relished purpose. And once their purpose was complete, they did not cling to life. Because to them, life, without meaning, was not worth preserving. It is said that before a mission, the Fidasti would fast. They would purify their body, recite verses in solitude, not to prepare for violence, but to strip away the ego, to become an instrument. Some wrote letters to no one. Some buried small tokens from their childhood. Some simply stood in the courtyard at dawn, breathing slowly, watching the horizon, as if waiting for a sign. But there was no sign, only silence. And in that silence, they walked forward. No fanfare, no banners, no glory, just the next step. The Western world, in time, took their name, assassin, and wrapped it in shadow and smoke. They became legend, nightmares, characters in stories whispered around fires, enemies of kings and friends to no one. But in the East, in the mountains, some still remembered them differently, not as monsters, but as a warning, a reminder that even the smallest force, if it moves with precision and belief, can shape the course of empires. You don't need a kingdom to change the world. You only need conviction, and time, and perhaps a moment no one will see coming. Some say the assassins are gone, buried under centuries of ash and rumor. But if you listen, truly listen, to the quiet between stories, you might still hear something. A footstep, a breath, a thought that no one else should know. And you wonder, was it history? Or is someone still watching? Waiting? Just in case. In the centuries that followed, the memory of the assassins faded from maps, but not from minds. They were no longer seen. But they were not forgotten, because the fear they inspired had seated itself too deeply. No ruler ever again trusted his inner circle completely. No fortress was ever truly secure, because the lesson had been learned. It only takes one voice, one blade, one belief, stronger than the promise of pain. And so the myth endured. Caravans passed stories from one side of the world to the other. A merchant in Damascus swore he met a man who could recite the Quran, Greek philosophy, and strategies of war without pause. Another, in the port of Tyre, sold a dagger he claimed was forged in Alamet, its handle wrapped in worn red cloth, its edge still clean. Fathers told their sons never to raise their hand in cruelty, not for fear of punishment, but for fear that somewhere, someone was watching, someone who believed that justice was not a throne, but a responsibility. Even empires that had never faced the assassins directly began to shape their courts with caution. They screened their messengers, they rotated their guards, they ate only what they prepared themselves. Because once fear like that enters a system, it never fully leaves. And yet, the assassins themselves had become invisible. No names, no strongholds, no demands. They simply ceased to be. But maybe that was always their intention, because the goal had never been conquest, never glory, never monuments to their name. The goal was to show the world that fear can be a weapon, sharper than any sword. That belief, when paired with discipline, can bend the knees of kings. To those who truly understood their philosophy, Alamet wasn't set a fortress. It was an idea. And ideas do not need walls to survive. They live in quiet corners, in conversations whispered between thinkers, in choices made by people who believe there must be another way. In the years that followed Alamet's steps fall, small groups emerged in distant lands. They didn't yet call themselves assassins. They didn't yet carry blades, but their silence was familiar, their organization precise, their loyalty absolute. Some historians dismiss these groups as coincidence, offshoots of different origins, unrelated. But the echoes are hard to ignore. A secret school hidden beneath a mosque in Egypt, where students were taught to question, to memorize, to disappear. A sect in the mountains of Syria, whose members had no recorded deaths, only disappearances. A man in Baghdad, executed for sedition, who said nothing during trial and smiled when the sentence was read. These were not assassins, but they remembered something older than armies, older than kings, something passed down not through blood, but through silence. The silence of discipline, the silence of certainty, the silence that says, we are still here. Every few decades, a new ruler would rise and ask the question aloud, what happened to the assassins? And each time, the answers would differ. Some claimed they were eradicated, buried beneath Mongol boots and burning scrolls. Others insisted they had simply changed, become advisors, poets, chroniclers. Some even believed they were hiding in plain sight, disguised not as warriors, but as peacekeepers. The truth was this: no one knew, and that, more than anything, was their final act of power, to erase themselves so perfectly that even history had to guess. But the legends lingered. In the narrow streets of Cairo, it was said a shadow would follow any unjust official. A quiet figure, never close, never threatening, until the day the official vanished. In Istanbul, an old woman known for healing soldiers told stories of a time when knives spoke louder than words, but only to those who deserved it. And in the mountains of Iran, a ruin stands where Alamet once breathed, just stone now, crumbling in the wind. A place tourists photograph without knowing what it was. But sometimes, just sometimes, a visitor will stop there, say nothing, and listen. And they still hear it. Not a voice, not a name, just that same silence, the one that always came before the act, because silence, true silence, was never absence, it was readiness. In modern times, the word assassin has lost its shape. It's been used to describe hired killers, lone wolves, mercenaries chasing coin. But that was never what they were. The original assassins didn't kill for gold. They didn't kill for nations. They killed for an idea, a dangerous one. That belief, no matter how small or fragile, was worth protecting. And sometimes, protection requires a knife, sharpened not with hate, but with purpose. There are whispers in academia, professors who collect old writings, translations half complete, symbols carved in margins of books no one knows how to read. They try to piece together the philosophy, the method, the lineage, but the truth stays out of reach, not because it's hidden, but because it was never written. It was lived, in glances, in choices, in breath held behind stone walls. There is power in things unrecorded, a story that survives not on paper, but in feeling. And maybe that's how it was always meant to be. Not a tale with names and dates, but a presence, a possibility that someone, somewhere, is still watching. Not to dominate, not to destroy, but to remind us that a blade in the dark, this is always a weapon. Sometimes, it's just a correction. Sometimes, it's balance. And sometimes, when the world forgets how to listen, history returns, not with armies, but with silence. It's strange how fear lingers longer than memory. Most people today could not name a single assassin, not a single target, not a single date, but the fear remains. In stories, in languages, in how people instinctively check behind them in moments of power. It lives in film, in novels, in whispered phrases like, "He came out of nowhere." But the assassins never came out of nowhere. They were always watching, always waiting. Their strike was never surprise, it was timing. They didn't move like predators. They moved like thoughts. Quiet, unnoticed, inevitable. The world today rushes. It floods itself with noise. Attention spans shrink. Memories stretch thin. But the way of the Fudasti was built on the opposite. Stillness, patience, presence. They didn't react. They absorbed. They studied. They became part of the space until they were indistinguishable from it. And when they acted, it was like gravity, not fast, not loud, but irreversible. Their legacy wasn't the bodies left behind. It was the calm they carried into danger. The knowledge that one person could shift the weight of the world with a single, silent step. They didn't teach rage at Alamet. They taught restraint, measured breath, the value of doing nothing until it was time. Some of their missions ended without violence. A message, carefully placed, delivered just close enough to be noticed, was sometimes enough. A knife left at the foot of a bed. A token from a loved one, found where it shouldn't be. A word spoken that only the target would understand. These were the prelude, and if that message was heeded, if the target withdrew, if they vanished from power, then nothing more was needed. Because the goal was not death, it was correction. The Fidio were not brutes, they were artisans of change. And like all artists, they understood that the most powerful works were often the most subtle. To those on the outside, it looked like terror, but inside the order, it was harmony. Every action part of a design, so vast, so deliberate, that even the ones who played their part rarely saw its full shape. They didn't need to. They trusted the silence, and that silence became their greatest ally. Because a rumor can go places a sword cannot, and the moment someone believes they are being watched, they change. Power begins to crack. when it no longer feels safe, and the assassins never had to break the wall. They only had to show that cracks were already there. Not every mission was remembered. Most were never known. Some acts of influence left no trace, except in the way a man changed course, resigned a position, or vanished without explanation. The world called those coincidences. The order called them alignment. What the outside world feared was not the death of a man. It was the death of certainty. Because if a ruler could be touched, who was safe? And the truth, no one was. Not if their actions tipped the balance. Not if their power served only itself. Even today, this philosophy lingers. In modern movements that reject systems of corruption. In lone figures who walk away from privilege to serve something quieter, deeper. In those who believe change does not have to be loud to be real. There are those who carry no blades, who lead no armies, but who know how to wait, how to listen, how to act, not with rage, but with reason. And whether they know it or not, they walk in the shadow of Alamet. In forgotten archives, certain symbols still surface. Circles within circles, a line drawn through a bird sip's eye, a single red dot beneath an otherwise blank seal. To scholars, these are curiosities. To a few, they are reminders that someone, somewhere, once believed so completely that they rewrote what power meant. Not with books, not with speeches, but with a choice, a single, disciplined, irreversible choice. And that was always the lesson, that change doesn't begin with armies. It begins with a moment, one soul, one breath, one decision made without pride, without ego, without reward. The Fidafta weren't yet shaped to be heroes. They weren't set built for praise. They were trained to let go of fame, of safety, of identity. Because you cannot be truly free while clinging to the need to be seen. This is why their legend lasts, not because of the bodies they left behind, but because of how they moved. Unhurried, focused, unseen. The world today moves fast. It glorifies noise, celebrates chaos, but deep in the current, there are still those who walk slowly, who wait, who choose not to be pulled by every wave. Perhaps they do not call themselves assassins. Perhaps they don't ask to even know the word. But the path they walk, the patience they carry, has a lineage, one that began in stone corridors, beneath oil lamps, where silence was sacred, and every breath was a vow. And maybe, just maybe, that path never ended. Maybe it still winds through cities and forests, across oceans and borders, invisible, but present. Because when you build a movement on belief and discipline, you don't need banners. You only need time. And time, the assassins understood, was always on their side. They say time forgets all things. Kings, wars, cities swallowed by sand and river, languages erased by silence. Even memories, precious and painful alike, fade. But some things refuse to be forgotten. Not because they were recorded, but because they were felt. And among those echoes, soft and persistent, walks the legacy of the assassins. Not in statues, not in stone, but in the unease that lingers, in places of unchecked power, because power remembers fear. Even when names are lost, the feeling stays, that quiet tension, that moment before the fall, that thought, what if someone is watching? And that is where they live now, not in ruins, not in relics, but in the pauses, in the moments when a tyrant hesitates, when a ruler wonders if their cruelty will be answered. They live in the doubt, and doubt, once planted, rarely dies. It doesn't take much to keep a legend alive. Not armies, not gold, not banners in the wind, only memory, a whisper, a glance too long from a stranger in a crowd. That is how shadows stretch across time, not loudly, but consistently. And in that way, the assassins became more than a group. They became a pattern, a possibility, because what they embodied, discipline, belief, silence, was something the world would always need, especially in moments when truth was drowned out by power. There are places, even now, where people speak of unseen guardians. Not angels, not soldiers, but watchers, listeners, those who wait. They don't intervene with thunder. They don't arrive in the light. But when corruption grows unchecked, when cruelty becomes custom, a message might appear, a symbol no one claims, a token from a story no one remembers clearly, and suddenly, someone powerful changes course. That's how you recognize the echo, not in the noise, but in the change that follows silence. And that's what the assassins understood better than anyone. Change begins in the quiet, not with a sword, but with the decision to wait for the right moment to act. There's a stillness the Fidye were trained to live inside, not the absence of movement, but the presence of intent, a deep awareness of when to speak, when to step, when to vanish. It said that some could sit for hours without blinking, breathing as if asleep until the moment arrived. A prince once boasted, he feared no man, no blade, no curse. He built walls 5 times thicker than his father Seps, surrounded himself with guards who swore loyalty by blood, and then, one morning, he found a letter on his pillow, no wax seal, no signature, only a single line. We do not need to kill you to remind you that we could. He left the palace that day. No one knows where he went, but his rule ended, quietly. That was the power they had cultivated, the ability to command with absence, to instruct without speaking, to force a choice by simply proving they were always closer than you imagined. Because control isn't taken, it's suds offered. When fear becomes a presence in the back of your thoughts. The Fidasti never had to scream. They didn't demand, they suggested. And those suggestions were often enough to rewrite destinies. They had learned that the dead don't argue, but the living who know they've been seen, carry that weight longer. And the world learned that no fortress is strong if the mind inside it is already undone. This is why they were so feared, not because of how they killed, but because of what they made their enemies feel. Before a single move was made, the fear was slow. It seeped through courtyards, into feasts, into the silence of bedrooms. It whispered, "You are not alone." And when a ruler believes they are not alone, they begin to flinch at loyalty, to question gifts, to turn on allies. And that unraveling was more effective than any dagger. A fortress could be breached by one man if the gatekeeper stopped trusting his keys. There is beauty in that kind of precision. Not because it is cruel, but because it respects the value of every move. That's what the Fidafti believed. No act should be wasted, no gesture without meaning. Even their deaths were placed carefully. When captured, they did not beg. They did not curse. They stood, spoke only what they must, and accepted their end with eyes that had already said goodbye. And that shook those who witnessed it, because it's hard to kill a man who is instead afraid to die, even harder to forget him. Their silence became more than a tactic. It became a message, one the world would read for centuries. And now, as we drift deeper into sleep, it lingers still. That thought, that whisper, that echo of a discipline so complete, so unwavering, that even history bends to it. The assassins may be gone, but what they taught us about patience, about purpose, about the power of a single life, deliberately lived, that stays, always. Sleep comes easiest when the world feels safe. But for most of human history, safety was a myth. Walls crumbled, oaths broke, armies turned in a single night, and yet there were those who could sleep deeply in the heart of danger, not because they were untouched by fear, but because they had made peace with it. The Fidafdi were trained not to erase fear, but to understand it, to sit beside it, as one might sit beside fire, respectfully, cautiously, and with clear intent. Because when you know what you fear, you know what you must overcome. And when you overcome fear, you become something the world cannot explain. A single soul, with nothing left to lose, is more dangerous than an army, especially if that soul has waited, patiently, silently, for just the right moment. There were no medals for waiting, no songs for the years spent, hidden in kitchens, temples, courtyards, no applause for the ones who did nothing until it was time to do everything. But they understood. They had trained for this, to live among those they might one day confront, to walk gently, to learn the faces, the routines, the kindnesses, and the cruelties, to blend in so perfectly that even they began to forget what they had once been called to do, until the signal came. Not shouted, not written, just felt, like a chord struck in the chest, after years of silence. And then they remembered. The calm returned. The mind cleared. The path ahead became simple. And when the act was done, they didn't celebrate. They didn't instead explain. They simply vanished. Because explanation was never the point, only impact. Some say they believed in paradise, a reward beyond this life, but not the paradise of gold and rivers, not the kind sung in sermons or written on scrolls. Their paradise was something quieter, a world where balance returned, where children did not fear rulers, and rulers feared their own cruelty, where wisdom outweighed violence, where faith was lived, not shouted. And to bring that world closer, even by a hair, was worth everything. That belief shaped their every breath. It guided their hand as they poured wine in a tyrant sip's cup, as they held open the door for a general who thought himself untouchable, as they stood quietly in the back of a courtroom where injustice dressed itself in law. They didn't need to raise their voice, because the blade, when it finally came, spoke clearly. And more than the death, it was the message left behind that changed things. That this was not vengeance. This was the consequence of arrogance. Not wrath, but realignment. Not chaos, but care. Not all their targets were kings. Some were judges. Some were scholars who traded truth for power. Some were simply voices too loud, too persuasive, spreading poison dressed as doctrine. Because the assassins understood, a dangerous idea, if left unchecked, can be more destructive than any sword. And so they watched, they listened, they waited. They did not silence disagreement, only corruption, only those who twisted belief into a cage for others. Their goal was not to control, it was to remove those who controlled unjustly. And when they acted, the world paused, because no one could say who would be next. There were no patterns, only purpose. That uncertainty did more than any campaign of war. It created hesitation, and hesitation, for those in power, was the beginning of humility. Even if for a moment, it is strange how silence can feel heavier than sound. But that was their gift, not to shout their cause from rooftops, but to step once, precisely, and let the world feel the weight of it, long after they were gone. And in that weight, in that stillness, was a kind of peace, not the peace of comfort, but the peace of knowing that someone somewhere was willing to wait a lifetime for the right moment to make things right. There are ruins now, where once the assassins trained, cold stones scattered across a hillside, archways half buried, Steps that once echoed with careful feet, now home to moss and wind. To most, it looks like the past, a fragment of history, quiet and spent. But to some, to those who Seft studied more closely, there are signs, a pattern in the floor stones, an inscription so faint it can set be photographed, a small chamber, with no doorway, and perfect acoustics, built, perhaps, not for speech, but for listening, because that Seft's where the order began, not with killing, with listening. Long before the blades, before the fear, there was only an idea that a world led by fear could only be undone by those unafraid of it. And so they listened, to rulers, to servants, to the broken and the bold. They listened for what was wrong, not just in politics, but in hearts. And when the pain grew too great, when silence was no longer enough, they moved, not out of vengeance, but out of duty. Duty. It's a word that has lost its weight in the modern tongue, too often mistaken for obedience or for blind service. But to the assassins, duty meant something else, something sacred. It meant acting even when no one would know, even when it meant death, even when the world would never understand what you did or why, because the act was not for applause. It was for balance, and balance, true balance, often arrives without a sound. A single life removed, a tide of cruelty interrupted, before it became a flood. They called it murder, they called it terrorism, but those were the words of the powerful, the ones who needed fear to stay in control. And so, they feared the assassins, not because they were many, but because they were few and deliberate. Because when the world trembles at the movement of one that sips not terror, that sips influence, earned not through force, but through a life designed for purpose. The assassins never sought legacy. That's why their legacy remains. Others built monuments, erected towers, had their names carved in stone, but stone erodes, names fade, time humbles even the greatest kings. The assassins built differently. They planted ideas, rooted in discipline, watered by silence. And those ideas grew quietly, into fear, into myth, into memory. Even now, in places far from the mountains of Persia, the word still carries weight. Assassin, a name passed down through language, twisted, reshaped, but never emptied. Because behind the word, there is still a presence, a shadow of certainty, of focus, of someone willing to do what no army ever could, not conquer, but correct. They didn't fight wars, they ended them before they began. They didn't inspire riots, they silenced those who profited from unrest. They didn't stick rule, and yet rulers feared them more than kingdoms. Because when belief becomes action, and action becomes silence, you no longer need to be seen, to be obeyed. Obedience can be demanded. Loyalty can be bought, but conviction must be grown. And in the gardens of Alamet, that was what they cultivated. Not hatred, not chaos, but conviction. A certainty that life is not meant to serve power, but to protect truth. That the greatest strength comes not from the sword, but from the will to act only when it truly matters. They believed in precision, that a single choice, if made at the perfect time, could save thousands. Not with glory, not with songs, but with the quiet knowledge that balance had been restored. We live now in a world of noise, but their lesson still hums beneath it. A quiet reminder that even in an age of spectacle, the most powerful movements to still begin in silence, with one person, watching, waiting, breathing, and then choosing, not for self, not for power, but for something deeper, something still worth protecting. History often remembers the loudest voices, the declarations, the conquests, the revolutions carved into marble and echoed in song. But there is another kind of history, the kind that leaves no fingerprints, no flags, no parade, only a shift, subtle, precise, irreversible. That was the assassin Seston legacy. Not the men they killed, but the moments they changed. Moments when a tyrant stepped back, when a cruel hand hesitated, when a city exhaled without knowing why. Those moments weren't set written in books, but they were felt, and they lasted. Because change, real change, does not always arrive with thunder. Sometimes it slips through the gate as a servant. Sometimes it sits at the edge of a banquet and says nothing. Sometimes it watches and waits. Waiting is a forgotten art. Today, everything urges action, every thought shared, every moment filled. But the assassins knew that rushing is the enemy of precision. So they trained in patience, in breathing, in stillness so deep that even a heartbeat could become a decision. They didn't strike when angry. They didn't act from impulse. They studied the pattern, and they found the point where one movement could change everything. That was the mission. Not to destroy, but to intervene, exactly when it mattered most. And in that stillness, they found clarity. They became mirrors to the world sips chaos, reflections untouched by noise. And so when they moved, the world noticed, not because of who they were, but because of what they represented. That one person, calm and prepared, can hold the weight of justice without shouting, and that made them dangerous, because it reminded the powerful that even in a world built to silence dissent, some silences cannot be controlled. There's something ancient about the way they lived, not in the sense of time, but in the sense of understanding, as if they had learned something the rest of the world forgot. That power doesn't last, that cruelty echoes, that every decision leaves a shadow, whether seen or not. And so they carried themselves with care. They walked slowly, spoke with intention, left no waste behind. Even their thoughts, their fears, were measured like tools in a craftsman's set's hands, not to suppress emotion, but to sharpen purpose, because a blade swings wildly when it's held in anger. But in a steady hand, it becomes something else, not a weapon, a solution. And they saw themselves that way, not as killers, but as correctives, an answer to a question that had gone too long unasked. And that is what the world fears most. Not the rebel, not the army, but the one who does not seek attention, who moves without praise, who gives their life to stop one injustice before it becomes many. There are no monuments to them, no grand tombs, no eternal flames, no public shrines. And that is exactly how they wanted it. Because once something is named, once it is claimed, it becomes vulnerable to pride, to distortion, to those who would wear the name, but forget the meaning. So the assassins disappeared, not only in body, but in legacy. They chose absence so their message could remain pure, and that message still lives, quietly, beneath the surface of history. You find it in acts of quiet courage, in whistleblowers who vanish after speaking truth, in protectors who act without recognition, in those who walk away from power because they know what it does to the heart. That's where they live now, not in names, not in robes, but in the choices made, in the silence between one breath and the next. The world doesn't see them. It never really did, but sometimes, when things feel just on the edge of collapse, when cruelty seems to have gone unchecked too long, balance returns, not with spectacle, not with ceremony, but with stillness. A small shift, a single life, willing to act when the world needed it most. Sometimes, the most powerful stories are the ones we tell ourselves, in the dark. Not because they seem comforting, but because they remind us that strength doesn't always roar. It listens, it waits, it acts only when it must. That's what the assassins understood. Not just how to fight, but how to live, with purpose wrapped in quiet. They did not crave attention, because attention draws questions, and questions demand answers. And the assassins knew, truth doesn't always need to be spoken, to be known. They became the answer to imbalance, not through politics, not through war, but through presence. Unseen, unshaken, unforgettable. The deeper their story drifts into history, the more people try to define it, to explain, to categorize, to make it fit into something familiar. But the assassins resisted that too. Even in memory, they remain undefined. They weren't set a religion, though they lived with devotion. They weren't set a government, though they influenced power. They weren't set just warriors. They were thinkers, translators, builders, and when necessary, removers. They removed the things that corrupted balance, not because it was easy, but because no one else would. And they understood, not every act of violence is cruelty. Not every act of peace is mercy. Sometimes mercy looks like a blade held steady until the moment becomes clear, and then it moves once, only once, because that was enough. One act, perfectly placed, and then silence again. What makes their story linger is not the death, but the discipline. Anyone can strike. Few can wait. Fewer still can walk among enemies and carry no hatred, because hatred clouds the mind. It rushes the hand. It leaves mistakes behind. But the assassins moved with clarity. They were trained to look beyond emotion, to see systems, patterns, long games played in shadows. They understood that a tyrant is not just one man, but the fear he creates, the loyalty he buys, the silence he forces. So when they acted, it wasn't set just to remove a figure. It was to disturb the network around him, to shake the illusion of invincibility, because once that illusion breaks, so does the grip of fear. They planted not just fear, but doubt. And doubt, once placed, grows wild. There is no handbook on how to change the world in silence, no map for when to act and when to wait. The assassins didn't need one. They trusted observation, stillness, the kind of deep listening that turns action into art, and over time, that trust became instinct, not impulse, but clarity. So when they stepped forward, it was not to cause chaos, but to remove it. They were never interested in rule. They knew that power corrupts slowly, even in the hands of the pure. Their aim was never to replace a tyrant, only to erase him, before others learned to follow. That's why they didn't write manifestos, why they vanished after each act, because their purpose was not to be praised, only to restore a balance that the world had forgotten. And in doing so, they became something more than history. They became a question, a soft, persistent one that lingers even now. If one soul can see clearly enough, can they shift the course of everything? And the answer, quiet as ever, remains yes. There are stories carved into the wind, ones that never found parchment or ink. They live only in the pause, between footsteps, in the still breath, before the moment. That's where the assassins lived, not in legend, but in the gap between certainty and doubt. And when they moved, just once, just precisely, the world felt it, even if it never knew who caused it. There is a kind of beauty in that kind of life, a life shaped not by achievement, but by precision, a life spent not seeking, but sensing. They moved like silence folded into a robe, and when they acted, it was like a line drawn across time, clear, irrevocable, not for glory, not for revenge, but because something had gone out of rhythm, and they knew how to set it right. It's as easy to overlook the quiet ones, the ones who say little, who ask more than they answer, who notice the smallest things but draw no attention to it. The assassins understood that power. They knew that in a world full of noise, the quiet becomes invisible. And invisibility, when chosen, is not weakness, it's freedom. Freedom to move unnoticed, to listen without being heard, to shape outcomes without owning them. That's how they operated, as observers, not just of actions, but of patterns. They saw what others missed, how a whisper in the right ear could end a war, how a single disappearance could inspire reform. They didn't build their legacy in monuments. They built it in moments. Moments that rewrote consequences. Moments that rippled out from one silent decision. And long after they had vanished, those ripples still moved. Sometimes, they were close enough to touch their target, not with a blade, just with a glance. And if the message was received, no blood was needed, only change, a resignation. A policy reversed, a sudden journey west, never explained. They called it influence. But for the assassins, it was correction. Because power, when left unchallenged, begins to rot. And sometimes, the only cure is presence. A presence that reminds those in control. Someone is watching. Someone who does not forget. Someone who does not forgive without reason. They became that reminder, not through threat, through readiness, because even the threat of being seen by someone with purpose is enough to change a man's path. And so the assassins changed the world, not by force, but by appearing only when it mattered most, and never again. That was the essence of their power, not in repetition, but in rarity. They didn't strike twice. They didn't send warnings. They acted once, precisely, and then vanished. Because when action is pure, it doesn't need to be repeated. And those who remained, those who felt the absence afterward, understood the message, that balance had been restored, that a hand had intervened, not to dominate, but to remind. Even now, in quiet places, some carry that same silence. You see it in their stillness, the way they choose their words, the way they listen before deciding anything. Maybe they are scholars, maybe artists, maybe just people who understand that true impact is never loud. The assassins are gone, at least by name, but the path they walked still winds through the world, through thought, through discipline, through lives built for moments that matter. And if one day, in a time of chaos, the world feels itself begin to tilt, maybe one of them will appear again, not to take power, only to restore what should never have been lost. Somewhere, deep in a mountain pass, a stone lies cracked open by time. It once formed part of a wall that protected silence, a wall that once held back the world, so those within could listen to the world more clearly. Now that stone is nothing, just rock, just moss, just shadow. But if you sit beside it and close your eyes, you might feel something, a trace, a pulse, not of life, but of purpose. Because purpose doesn't die with time, it simply waits for someone to remember it, to breathe in slowly, and ask not what can I do for power, but what should be done when no one else will. That is where the assassins began, and that is where they still are. In those questions, and that surface when no one is watching. In those moments when silence asks something of you, not loudly, not with demand, just presence, waiting for your answer. In every age, there are those who watch from the edge, not because they are afraid to enter, but because they see too clearly what happens when power forgets humility. These watchers do not wear symbols. They do not gather armies. They do not post their oaths. They simply live quietly, intentionally, with the kind of patience that unnerves the impatient. The assassins were not relics of a lost time. They were an answer to a question that keeps returning. What happens when no one stops the strong? When justice becomes noise? When fear becomes normal? They responded with discipline, with calm, with acts so precise, the world mistook them for myth. But they weren't set myths. They were the silence between empires, the whisper behind the crown, the balance no one sees until it steps missing. And when it is, when things tip too far, you don't always hear footsteps. Sometimes, you just feel a shift so small, most people miss it. A rumor that fades before it spreads. A resignation without reason. A corridor left empty. On the one day it mattered. That was their design. The assassins didn't crave attention because they understood the danger of legacy. Not just to the world, but to the soul. Because when your actions begin to serve your name, you lose the purity of the mission. So they abandoned name. They let go of credit. They moved like wind through branches, felt, but never caught. And that's why their story is still told. Not through monuments, but through instincts. That sudden doubt before a cruel decision. That quiet turning away from something unjust. Maybe it's just conscience. But maybe it's memory. A deep memory, carried through time. By those who understood that justice is not an event. It is a posture, held, defended, lived, even when the world forgets. Especially then. They say the best blades are the ones never drawn. The same was true for the assassins. Their power wasn't set in the act. It was in the restraint. They trained for years, sometimes decades, not to sharpen the hand, but to calm the heart. Because the moment of decision must be clean, free of pride, free of anger. A blade held by rage may strike twice, but never truly lands. Their way was different, precise, singular. One motion, one change, and then stillness again. And over time, the world came to understand. Even silence can have weight. Even absence can shape destiny. That's how you know. They were never just killers. They were reminders. That balance must be guarded. That truth must sometimes be defended, without banner or title. That one soul, aligned, ready, present, can undo empires. And when you close your eyes tonight and feel the hush of a world finally resting, remember, that hush was made possible by someone, somewhere, who chose to act exactly when the world needed stillness. Some truths done, it need to be taught. They Seer remembered, buried deep beneath noise and habit, not learned, but uncovered, like a path beneath leaves. That was always there. The assassins didn't invent that path. They just chose to walk it. When most turned away, because it's not an easy way. It asks for your ego, your name, your comfort. It asks you to move through life like a question. What needs to be done, even if no one sees me do it? And that question, once accepted, becomes a guide. It shapes the hand, the breath, the timing, and with enough time, it becomes the person. A person the world never expects, because they do not look dangerous. They look ordinary. They serve tea. They tend gardens. They pass quietly on the street, until the moment they don't set, until the moment everything changes, not with noise, but with choice. That was their greatest strength. Not disguise, but intention. They didn't hide. They simply became part of the world they watched. And in doing so, they moved through it, like breath through cloth, unnoticed, unfeared, until the moment required otherwise. And then, when the moment arrived, they did not hesitate, because hesitation comes from doubt, and doubt, for them, had been trained away, not through cruelty, but through clarity. They had spent their lives studying cause and effect, studying the fragile thread that holds order together. And they knew when it frayed, they knew when it snapped, and they knew how to tie it back, quickly, quietly, without unraveling the rest. That was their way. Not to dominate, to preserve, not to destroy systems, but to remind them why they existed in the first place. To serve the people, to guard balance, to reflect justice. And when those systems forgot, the assassins remembered for them. Not all justice needs to be loud. Not all change demands revolution. Some change arrives like snowfall, soft, soundless, but undeniable in the morning. That's what the assassins understood. They didn't need monuments, because they left something more enduring. A standard. A sense that somewhere, even in the most corrupt courts and cruelest cities, someone might still be watching. Someone who expects better. Someone who can make the decision others are too afraid to face. And that presence, even unspoken, was enough. Enough to keep hands from reaching too far. Enough to keep violence in check. Enough to remind the world that power does not make a man untouchable. Purpose does. Purpose sharpens the mind, steadies the breath, turns even the smallest act into a blade of its own. And when that act arrives, the world remembers, if only for a moment, what it means to be accountable. Accountability was the thread they followed, even when it led through danger, even when it meant never being known. They held to it, not because they were told to, but because they believed that truth, once known, cannot be ignored. And so they became its protectors, not in speech, in stillness, not in anger, in calm, not in power, in choice. The choice to step forward at the exact moment when everyone else stepped back. That's what made them different. Not the knife, not the code, not the fortress tucked into mountain stone, but the willingness to wait until the moment mattered most, and then move, once, clearly, without regret. And in that single motion, they left behind a ripple, stronger than any army, a ripple that still reaches us, in quiet decisions, in the urge to do what's right, even when unseen. Because in every age, someone picks up that silence, wears it like a cloak, and waits to remind the world, justice does not vanish. It only grows quiet, until it is needed again. There is something sacred about the end of a path walked well, not because it concludes, but because it completes. The assassins never promised answers. They weren't set builders of empires or destroyers of worlds. They were stewards of balance, carriers of a silence older than any law. And now, as we rest in the space they once protected, you can feel it, that same stillness they lived by. It doesn't press, it doesn't chase, it waits, because truth doesn't need to rush. And justice, when real, is never late. There is something sacred about the end of a path walked well. Not because it concludes, but because it completes. The assassins never promised answers. They weren't spit builders of empires or destroyers of worlds. They were stewards of balance, carriers of a silence older than any law. And now, as we rest in the space they once protected, you can feel it, that same stillness they lived by. It doesn't press, it doesn't chase. It waits because truth doesn't need to rush. And justice, when real, is never late. You may never know their names. You may never see their faces. You may pass the ruins they built and mistake them for stone that never mattered. But that sips the beauty of their legacy. It does not demand memory. It only asks this: when the moment comes, will you notice it? That quiet invitation. That breath between right and easy. That space where action waits, without applause. That sips where they lived. And maybe that steps where they still do. In you. In the pause before a decision. In the feeling that someone, somewhere, once stood in a place like this and chose the harder path. Not for glory, not for reward, but because it was time. That is the silence they left behind. A silence that doesn't to fade, because it belongs to anyone brave enough to carry it. So now, as your eyes grow heavy and the breath becomes softer, let their silence wrap around you. Not as a story, not as history, but as a presence. Still, steady, waiting. Not for the world to notice, just for the right moment.